They said the empire ended. Flags were lowered, anthems changed, and speeches about liberty filled the air. But power, real power, does not vanish. It mutates. It hides inside contracts, currencies, and military pacts. It reappears in polite smiles at summits, in the fine print of cooperation agreements. And for much of Africa, one shadow has remained constant, the tricolor shadow of France. When the last French governors sailed home in the early 1960s, Paris celebrated the birth of more than a dozen new nations. Yet in the corridors of the Élysée, another birth was taking place, that of Françafrique, the system that would bind the new states to their former master. General Charles de Gaulle's advisor, Jacques Foccart, understood that control did not require occupation. As he put it later, we had to invent independence while keeping our interests. Independence became theater. The real script was written elsewhere. The architecture of a ghost empire Foccart built a web that mixed politics, business, and intelligence. Oil companies such as Elf Aquitaine, banks, and French military officers formed the backbone. African leaders who accepted the deal, men like Houphouët-Boigny in Côte d'Ivoire, Omar Bongo in Gabon, or Gnassingbé Eyadema in Togo, received French protection, loans, and sometimes troops. In return, Paris received loyalty, access to raw materials, and the comfort of influence. It was an elegant mechanism. The CFA franc kept African economies pegged to the French treasury. Defense agreements allowed French troops to remain stationed in independent countries. French companies controlled key exports: oil, cocoa, uranium. Intelligence officers ensured that leaders who turned away from Paris did not last long. François-Xavier Verschave, one of the earliest whistleblowers, would later write in La Françafrique, le plus long scandale de la République. Behind the facade of aid and friendship lay a system of corruption, coup, and coercion, a parallel empire serving French interests. Through the 1960s and 1970s, the pattern repeated. When a leader sought genuine independence, chaos followed. Sylvanus Olympio of Togo was killed in 1963 after attempting to leave the CFA zone. Modibo Keïta of Mali, who dreamed of a socialist, self-reliant Africa, was overthrown in 1968. And when Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso declared in the 1980s that he who feeds you controls you, his revolution lasted only 4 years before the bullets came. Publicly, France called its African partners friends. In private, ministers referred to them as pré carré, the private garden. The pré carré was to be cultivated, protected, and kept within reach. French diplomats managed African files as if they were provincial matters. The African embassies in Paris often had less autonomy than a French prefect. Meanwhile, culture played its own part. The French language, broadcast through schools and radio, carried not only words, but worldviews. The philosopher Achille Mbembe later observed in On the Post-Colony that colonial power survives through the imagination it implants, the hierarchy of what counts as modern, civilized, or valuable. To speak French fluently was to access opportunity. To challenge French authority was to risk isolation. The result was psychological as much as political. During the Cold War, this arrangement suited both sides. France presented itself to Washington as the guardian of stability in Africa, a buffer against Soviet influence. In exchange, it enjoyed a free hand in its pré carré. French troops intervened repeatedly: Chad in 1969, Zaire in 1978, Côte d'Ivoire in 2002, Mali decades later. Each time, the official story was to restore order. Each time, French companies quietly resumed business as usual. Fanon had warned of this new kind of domination. In The Wretched of the Earth, he wrote, "The national bourgeoisie of underdeveloped countries is not interested in bringing about the disappearance of colonialism. It is perfectly content with playing the role of business agent for the Western bourgeoisie." Those words read like prophecy. The elite networks of Françafrique became exactly that. African leaders as brokers between foreign capital and local resources, while the masses remained spectators to their own independence. By the early 1980s, Françafrique had become an institution. French officers no longer needed to plot coups. The network sustained itself through banks, ministries, and friendships. The oil giant Elf Aquitaine became a diplomatic instrument. Executives were known to fund campaigns for African presidents, who in turn granted lucrative exploration rights. Money moved quietly between Libreville, Paris, and Geneva, a flow of gratitude disguised as development. The French Fifth Republic changed leaders, but the African file barely moved. From de Gaulle to Pompidou, from Giscard to Mitterrand, the same African presidents attended the same summits. They called Mitterrand le camarade socialiste, and he called them Amis de la France. Yet, the remained. In 1998, the journalist François-Xavier Verschave described this continuity as the longest scandal of the Republic, a web of corruption so normalized that it seemed invisible. During these years, French presence adapted to global realities. Direct colonial command was replaced by economic doctrine, privatization, structural adjustment, and the promise of modernization through the IMF and the World Bank. African economies, already tied to the CFA franc, were asked to liberalize, to open markets, reduce public spending, and welcome foreign investors. In practice, this meant deeper dependency. Schools closed, hospitals deteriorated, while extraction of oil, bauxite, and uranium accelerated. Paris justified its permanent bases as protection against instability. In the 1980s and 1990s, French soldiers were present in Djibouti, Gabon, Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Chad. Whenever local unrest threatened French interests, planes took off. The historian Antoine Glaser once wrote that France did not so much defend Africa as defend its position in Africa. The pattern was visible. 1978. Operation Léopard in Zaire to rescue hostages and mineral routes. 1983. Intervention in Chad to support President Habré. 1990. Operation Norat in Rwanda. 1994. Operation Turquoise during the genocide, officially humanitarian but later criticized for protecting the defeated regime. Each operation reinforced the message. Paris remained the ultimate guarantor of order. The cracks begin to show. By the late 1990s, a new generation of Africans started to question the arrangement. University movements in Dakar, Abidjan, and Yaoundé debated Françafrique openly. Journalists uncovered the hidden finances of Elf Aquitaine. Intellectuals such as Achille Mbembe and Celestin Monga called for a post-colonial consciousness that would free Africa not just from French influence, but from the internal habits of dependence. Mbembe wrote, "The post-colony is haunted by the ghosts of both empire and nation. The challenge is to invent a new time, outside the cycle of tutelage and resentment." Meanwhile, Africa's demographics changed. The majority of citizens had been born after independence. For them, the French connection felt less like protection and more like a leash. In 1990, François Mitterrand delivered his famous speech in La Baule, promising that French aid would henceforth depend on democracy. It sounded like a moral revolution. In reality, aid continued to flow to old allies regardless of elections. When the Cold War ended, France lost the excuse of anti-communism, but not the habit of interference. The figure of Thomas Sankara refused to die. He had been killed in 1987, but his words, recorded in dusty archives and shared in classrooms, returned like prophecy. Our revolution is not against any country. It is against the system of exploitation, he had declared. To speak of sovereignty after Sankara meant speaking of dignity, environmental care, and women's liberation, not just borders. His death became a shorthand for the price of autonomy in a world still policed by old empires. At the turn of the 2000s, Françafrique was officially disowned. President Jacques Chirac claimed to end the era of personal networks. A new generation of African leaders, Wade in Senegal, Gbagbo in Côte d'Ivoire, Compaoré in Burkina Faso, spoke the language of democracy and globalization. Yet behind the rhetoric, military bases stayed open and the CFA franc remained pegged to the euro. The wars in the Great Lakes and West Africa exposed another dimension. The competition for resources no longer limited to France. The United States and China had entered the scene. France began to reposition itself as a partner among many, but its influence, though reduced, persisted through culture, education, and security cooperation. The French language remained a crucial link. Institutions such as the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie promoted cultural solidarity, but critics argued that they perpetuated linguistic dependency. African writers from Léopold Sédar Senghor to Alain Mabankou debated whether French could be decolonized or whether true liberation required linguistic plurality. As Mabankou later wrote, "We did not inherit the French language. We appropriated it. What matters is what we do with it." Universities and media channels continued to shape elites who often studied in Paris before returning home to govern. The result was a generation fluent in French policy frameworks and political etiquette, but struggling to define an authentic African modernity. The early 2000s brought both renewal and disillusion. When France intervened in Côte d'Ivoire in 2002 under Operation Licorne, it claimed neutrality. Many Ivorians saw it as proof that colonial reflexes survived. In 2013, Operation Serval in Mali, later followed by Barkhane, was again presented as a fight against terrorism, yet it revived the question: why do African states still rely on French troops for security? In response, new voices call for rethinking sovereignty through continental alliances and South-South cooperation. The Pan-African Parliament, the African Union, and regional blocs like ECOWAS tried to assert autonomy. But the economic structure, the dependence on exports, price in euros, the control of strategic sectors by multinational corporations remained stubborn. Achille Mbembe summarized the paradox in a 2016 lecture. Africa is both the laboratory and the mirror of global capitalism. To escape dependency, it must invent futures that are not mere reactions to Europe. By the year 2000, African streets were louder than African ministries. Markets buzzed with imported goods from China. Youth carried mobile phones made in Shenzhen, and satellite dishes pointed not only toward Paris but toward the world. The empire's voice was no longer the only one in the air. Yet the architecture of dependence still stood. The CFA franc, first tied to the French treasury, later to the euro, continued to anchor 14 African economies. It was introduced in 1945 as the Franc des colonies françaises d'Afrique and rebranded several times. But its mechanism stayed the same. Half of the foreign exchange reserves of member states were held in a French treasury account. Economists such as Ndongo Samba Sylla and Fanny Pigeot would later write in their 2018 book L'arme invisible de la Françafrique that the CFA was a colonial relic wearing a neoliberal suit. For Paris, it meant predictability. For African governments, it meant stability, at the cost of monetary sovereignty. After 9/11, France joined the global campaign against terrorism. In Africa, this translated into renewed military partnerships. When northern Mali fell to jihadist groups in 2012, French jets bombed their convoys and Operation Serval was born. President François Hollande announced to the world that France has no vocation to remain, but French soldiers stayed under the renamed Operation Barkhane, headquartered in N'Djamena, Chad. Officially, the aim was to help African armies, but the symbolism was powerful. Once again, French troops patrolled African deserts, guarded airports, and supplied intelligence. For many in Bamako and Niamey, it felt like déjà vu. The young Malian writer Youssouf Diallo told Jeune Afrique in 2016, "We asked for help. We did not ask for guardians." At the same time, the U.S. built drones bases in Niger. China opened its first overseas base in Djibouti. and Russia sold weapons from Bangui to Bamako. The post-colonial field had become multipolar, yet France still held the map it had drawn decades earlier. Coups and continuities. Between 2005 and 2020, nearly every region of Francophone Africa experienced political crises that revived old patterns. In Togo, the Ayatollah dynasty continued. In Chad, Idriss Déby balanced rebellion and support from Paris until his death in 2021. In Madagascar, coups in 2002 and 2009 signaled how fragile the institutions built after independence remained. Each crisis was followed by international mediation in which Paris inevitably played a role, as financier, as host, or as discreet advisor. These events did not always stem from direct foreign plotting. They were the result of a political culture long conditioned by external validation. As the Cameroonian scholar Francis Nyamjo observed, dependence is a habit that teaches us to look outward for solutions and inward for permission. Meanwhile, the debate about history reached new intensity. In 2010, the 50th anniversary of African independence triggered exhibitions, documentaries, and anger. Younger Africans no longer wanted to celebrate symbolic freedom while visa queues snaked around French embassies. On YouTube, activists dissected the CFA Franc. On Twitter, hashtags like #Stop Françafrique trended after every French intervention. French officials began to respond. In 2017, President Emmanuel Macron stood before students at the University of Ouagadougou and promised a new partnership built on equality. He even invited the economist Sylla and others to discuss monetary reform. But when his convoy was pelted with stones the same week, the message from the street was clearer than any communique. Speeches could not erase decades of resentment. In 2019, 8 West African nations announced that the CFA Franc, West African branch, would be replaced by a new currency, the ECO. The French finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, called it a historic turning point. In reality, the transition maintained most of the existing arrangements, the euro peg, the French guarantee, and the gradual handover of reserves. Critics called it cosmetic, supporters called it pragmatic. Across talk shows and university halls from Dakar to Lomé, the argument raged. Could a currency born of colonial convenience ever serve true independence? The Ghanaian thinker George Adie once said, "Without economic liberation, political freedom is a flag without wind." His words echoed anew. Even as governments debated monetary policy, the battle for cultural influence continued. French television channels such as France 24 and TV5 Monde broadcast news across the continent, while African music filled Parisian clubs. The relationship had become reciprocal but unequal, a dance between admiration and frustration. Writers like Kidi Bego, Fatou Diome, and Alain Mabankou used literature to interrogate belonging, migration, and the memory of empire. Their novels reached both African and European audiences, creating a shared, uneasy consciousness of the past. The decade of the 2020s opened with uniforms once again in the presidential palaces of West and Central Africa. Mali, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, Gabon. The list grew like a rhythm of déjà vu. Each time, the justification sounded familiar. Corruption, insecurity, the failure of political elites to deliver dignity. And each time, crowds cheered the soldiers, waving national flags and, more tellingly, not a few Russian ones. For France, it was a shock. After nearly a decade of leading counterterrorism operations in the Sahel, it suddenly found its troops unwelcome. In 2022, Mali demanded the withdrawal of Operation Barkhane. By 2023, the bases in Niger and Burkina Faso followed. President Macron declared, "France's era of tutelage is over," but on the streets of Bamako, people replied, "It was never supposed to begin." The new juntas were not all ideologically united. Some sought pragmatic nationalism. Others played the card of external realignment. But together, they represented a generational rupture, a refusal of the paternal language of cooperation. Slogans such as "France dégage," painted on walls from Niamey to Ouagadougou, captured a mood more emotional than strategic. The historian Ousmane Kane wrote in Beyond Timbuktu that the rejection of the former metropole is not only political, it is a search for self-definition. In that search, France became a mirror against which to imagine freedom. Russia, China, Turkey, and Gulf powers stepped into the gap with offers of arms, infrastructure, and investment. Whether these new partners represent liberation or simply another form of dependency remains open, but the multiplicity itself signals the decline of a single European center of gravity. Even as soldiers replaced presidents, the structural questions persisted. How to trade when your currency remains pegged to another continent? How to industrialize when export routes and prices are set elsewhere? Economist Carlos Lopez, in Africa in Transformation, warned that monetary arrangements inherited from colonial times have locked economies into patterns of extraction rather than creation. His argument found resonance as young entrepreneurs, tech developers, and farmers across Francophone Africa began experimenting with local startups, cryptocurrencies, and regional trade to bypass the old order. Confronted with diminishing leverage, Paris shifted its discourse from command to partnership. Macron's 2023 visit to Libreville and Luanda emphasized environmental cooperation and private sector investment rather than military. France also sponsored initiatives for returning African cultural artifacts, a symbolic gesture that some welcomed as historic and others saw as late repentance. At the same time, the European Union attempted to maintain a collective foothold through economic and migration agreements. Analysts describe this as post-Françafrique, not the end of influence, but its mutation into multilateral frameworks. While global attention focused on the Sahel, another frontier of the old empire simmered, the Comoros archipelago. Among its islands, Mayotte remains under French administration, officially a département d'outre-mer since 2011. For neighboring Comorians, this is unfinished decolonization. For France, it is an internal matter. Each year, thousands risk their lives crossing the short stretch of water from Anjouan to Mayotte, chasing work, education, or simply the illusion of Europe within Africa. The tension over Mayotte reveals that the question of sovereignty is not confined to coups or currencies. It lives in every border, every visa queue, every patrol boat in the Indian Ocean. Perhaps the most profound shift of all is cultural. On social media, young Africans debate not in Parisian French, but in hybrids of Wolof, Bambara, Lingala, Swahili, English, and slang. Their heroes are local. They are not waiting for permission to define what being modern and African means. For them, France is neither enemy nor guardian, merely one actor among many in a crowded world. By the middle of the 2020s, France's presence in Africa is lighter but still tangible in universities, energy projects, and language itself. What has changed is perception. The curtain has been pulled back. Every aid package, every military exercise, every embassy statement is now scrutinized by a public that knows its history. The strings, once invisible, are debated openly, and in that transparency lies a form of emancipation. As the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe reminded audiences in his 2020 lecture at the Collège de France, the goal is not to reverse dependence, but to invent new interdependence, chosen rather than imposed. That sentence captures the horizon toward which many African thinkers now point, a world where relations with France and with all former powers are negotiated on equal footing. Reclaiming a narrative is not a single action. It is thousands of small interventions, a historian publishing an archival document, a tech founder building a payments platform in Accra or Dakar, a farmer refusing exploitative contract terms and organizing cooperatives, a prosecutor in an African capital charging a high-profile official for embezzlement. Each act chips away at the dependencies that colonial structures enshrine. There is a language that recurs when people talk about liberation: dignity. Thomas Sankara, whose words continue to pulse through contemporary African debate, reminded his listeners that sovereignty is not merely political, it is social and economic. He who feeds you controls you, Sankara said, and he meant that dependence on external aid or imported staples was itself a structure of domination. The lesson echoes now in an era where African policymakers talk openly about industrial policy instead of mere structural adjustment, about value-added exports instead of raw commodities shipped abroad. The first field of contestation is economic policy. The question is not only whether to keep a currency peg or to create a new monetary union. It is how to organize economies so that they create value domestically. The pragmatic alternatives multiply: regional manufacturing clusters, textile mills in Ethiopia's industrial parks, agro-processing in the Niger Delta, lithium refining in parts of southern Africa, show that with patient public policy and private investment reoriented toward local markets, states can begin to anchor employment and accumulate technical capacity. It is slow, uneven work, and it requires strategy, protective tariffs that are temporary and graduated, incentive regimes tied to training and local sourcing, and public procurement policies that privilege domestic suppliers. Digital platforms, mobile money, and decentralized finance are not magic bullets, but they are tools Africans use to circumvent some of the choke points of the old order. When a farmer in rural Senegal can access a market price on her phone and accept digital payment directly, the middlemen tied to export circuits have less power. When remittances flow through low-cost digital rails rather than expensive formal channels controlled by Western banks, family incomes stabilize. African developers are not waiting for permission to design systems suited to their realities. They are building them. For decades, African governments repeatedly outsourced security to Western partners on the grounds that the capacities did not exist at home. The interventions in the Sahel, for example, had mixed results. The presence of foreign troops sometimes shut down violent insurgencies temporarily, but it did not build durable institutions. The new conversation is about security sector reform on African terms, transparent budgets, civilian oversight, judicial accountability, and regional policing coalitions that are more than ad hoc reaction forces. If armies and police are professionalized to serve citizens rather than external logics, the chance of cycles of coups and counter-coups diminishes. For too long, European archives told the story of Africa through the lens of extraction. Scholars, journalists, and artists are rewriting that story, publicly, forcefully. The era when Paris had singular leverage is fading. The world is multipolar. China, India, Turkey, the Gulf states, and Russia offer investments and weapons in exchange for access. These relationships are not automatically emancipatory. Any external partner can reproduce dependency if terms are extractive. The critical shift is African agency in selecting and shaping partnerships. This means negotiated contracts with transparency clauses, revenue sharing modeled to enrich local communities, and arbitration mechanisms that ensure disputes are heard in neutral forums. It means cultivating many partners, not one patron. All of these fields, economic policy, technology, security, culture, diplomacy, converge in the lived experience of citizens. And here the role of youth is decisive. Africa is young. A majority of its population is under 30. This demographic is not merely a statistic, it is a political force with new habits and new expectations. Young people use meme culture to mock elite arrogance, crowdfunding to support independent journalism, and student unions to push for better services. When they take to the streets, as happened across West Africa and in Antananarivo, it is often because the broken social contract is intolerable. Their anger is not necessarily a blueprint for governance, but it is a moral imperative for the reformers who seek to channel it toward institution building rather than personalist rule. That brings us, inevitably and necessarily, back to the Indian Ocean and to the symbolism of islands. Mayotte and the Comoros are, in political geography, a small set of landmasses. In the moral geography of decolonization, they are a wound that refuses to heal. Mayotte's status as a French overseas department, while the other Comoros islands gained independence, is both a legal reality and a sore point. Migrant RHOs cross these waters. Families split by borders. Fishermen's nets cut clauses of maritime jurisdiction in ways that affect livelihoods. The sight of rubber boats arriving at Mayotte with people fleeing economic desperation is at once a human tragedy and a reminder that questions of sovereignty are not only diplomatic posturing, they are daily life. Madagascar's recent crisis must be read against this oceanic backdrop. The country's strategic location in the Indian Ocean and its claims over nearby islets, such as the Îles Éparses, sit at the intersection of geopolitics and post-colonial grievance. To speak of Madagascar without speaking of the Comoros and Mayotte is to miss the line that links river to sea, territory, migration, identity, and historical injustice. These are not mere footnotes. They are the substantive claims through which peoples demand the dignity of self-determination. If the task ahead is systemic, so too must be the responses. What would a substantive program of decolonial transformation look like? It would begin with honest audits, transparency in contracts, public registries of beneficial ownership, and independent commissions to review the terms under which natural resources were ceded. It would then move to redistribution, sovereign wealth funds managed for future generations, revenues directed toward education and public health, and land reform that recognizes historical dispossession. It would prioritize capacity building, technical institutes, vocational training, and judicial reform to ensure that law is an instrument of fairness rather than capture. It would insist on regional cooperation, larger markets, harmonized standards, pooled procurement for medicine to reduce dependence, a digital single market to allow African platforms to scale. All of this sounds technocratic, and in many ways, it is technical. But the technical and the moral are braided. When a health system functions and a child survives, that is dignity in practice. When a student can study history without apology for questioning the past, that is dignity in learning. When a village receives fair payment for the minerals dug from its soil, that is dignity in economics. Yet we must be honest about difficulty. The rigor of reform collides with the force of vested interests. Madagascar, for instance, suffers from a brittle state apparatus where patronage determines access to services and contracts. The same is true in many states where elite networks reconfigure themselves to absorb change rather than cede power. The effort to curtail corruption and to democratize economic opportunity will meet resistance, not only from external actors but from domestic coalitions that prospered under the old arrangements. So how do movements win against such entrenched interests? They do so through coalitions, civil society aligning with reformist political actors, journalists cooperating with independent judges, international partners conditioned upon accountability measures. They do so through a kind of patient insurgency of institutions, reforming one ministry at a time, establishing one transparent procurement process at a time. They do so by keeping the moral frame public. Dignity must be the metric by which policies are judged. This is where the arts and storytelling matter as much as policy papers. Literature, film, music, and comedy shape public imagination. When artists retell stories of slavery, colonization, resistance, and joy, they alter what is acceptable to discuss in public. When comedians mock arbitrary visas, when filmmakers document the painful crossings to Mayotte, when poets memorialize Sankara's insistence on self-reliance, all of these interventions shift culture. Culture makes politics legible and mobilizes consent for far-reaching change. In the next decades, the battle will not be solely against foreign influence. It will be against the temptation to substitute one external patron for another, against the comfort of short-term fixes, and against the insider deals that hollow reform. The better fight is one that builds resilient economies, invests in human capital, reforms legal systems, and centers dignity as the measure of success. So what does it mean for the listener who is Pan-Africanist, impatient, and determined? It means this. Map the power, expose the history, but do not stop at denunciation. Build, vote, organize, support independent media and public defenders. Teach the young not only the names of the colonizers, but the names of pre-colonial states, inventions, and languages. Back entrepreneurs who hire locally. Demand that your governments be transparent in contracts and accountable in matters of security and currency. France will remain part of the conversation. so will many others. The question is less who dominates the stage than who writes the script. If the people, organized, literate, and politically engaged, write it, then sovereignty becomes more than a slogan. It becomes a practice. Thomas Sankara once said that you cannot carry out fundamental change without a certain amount of madness. Maybe. But it is not madness to insist that the next decades be ones in which Africa's future is authored by African hands for African needs. That is both a moral project and a technical one. The arts will inspire it. The economists will plan it. The lawyers will institutionalize it. And the young will keep the pressure. This is not a tidy ending. It cannot be. Decolonization has always been messy. But it is an ongoing fight, and one whose logic is no longer hidden behind the polished phrases of partnership. The strings of the past are visible now. They can be cut, replaced by webs of mutual accountability, or retied in new patterns that serve a different set of interests. The choice is ours. We will not be free because one power relents. We will be free because we build institutions that do not allow anyone, external or domestic, to substitute private gain for public welfare. We will be free because the next generation stops asking permission and starts designing. We will be free when the map in every classroom names places like Mayotte and the Comoros not as afterthoughts, but as living entrants in the story of a continent reinventing itself. And with that, our three-part journey concludes. Conclusion. When we strip away the headlines and the diplomatic phrasing, what remains is a simple truth. The story of France and Africa has always been about power, who holds it, who pretends to, and who finally decides to take it back. From Dakar to Antananarivo, from Bamako to Moroni, you can feel a continental heartbeat quickening. The era of hidden strings is ending. The puppets are learning to cut their own chords. Not because France suddenly lets go, but because Africa is no longer built to be held. The coups, the protests, the contested elections, these are not just crises. They are symptoms of a deeper negotiation between the old world and the new. A negotiation about dignity, about the right to imagine a future without permission. Mayotte stands as a symbol in that conversation, an island claimed, divided, and still aching for resolution. Its waters remind us that independence is not a single declaration, but an ongoing tide. Every wave that crashes on those shores whispers the same question: how long can history remain unfinished? To the listener, especially the Pan-Africanist who refuses cynicism, remember that freedom is not inherited. It is engineered. It is built in classrooms and parliaments, in the quiet integrity of public service, in the courage to question the familiar. France will continue to act. Powers will continue to compete. But the continent's real revolution lies elsewhere. In the steady emergence of Africans who no longer see themselves as peripheral players in someone else's play. So let this be our final reflection. The strings that once bound can also be woven into bridges. What was once manipulation can become negotiation. What was dependency can become partnership, if and only if Africa writes the terms. That is the unfinished work. That is the task before this generation. And that, more than any coup or treaty, will decide who truly commands the stage.